Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We see people starting to come into the room. And while that's happening, I just want to, again, welcome everybody this evening for our conversation about admissions and testing updates in what is sure to be another unusual and unprecedented year. So we have a lot to talk about tonight. Thank you so much for the questions that you submitted in advance. You'll be hearing them as we make our way through. If you have any other questions, please put them in the Q&A box, not the chat, and we'll be monitoring that as we go. And this will be recorded for those of you who might not be able to join us live. So without further ado, I will pass it along to our wonderful moderator, Leslie Singer.
Hello, I'm Leslie Singer of Brown Harris Stevens, and yes, I will be moderating this evening. And it's my pleasure always to be working with Dr. Bari Norman, who is the co-founder and head counselor of Expert Admissions, and Sasha DeWind, who is the CEO of Tutor Associates. We usually like to start the evening with a poll, just so we can see who we have in attendance.
Yes.
So
this helps us tailor some of our responses and our focus. So thank you for participating. Still coming in, so thanks for your patience. All right, so a couple of votes still coming in, but it basically is hovering right around 60% 11th graders. Okay. Followed by 12th graders, a little over 15%, and then we've got 9th and 10th graders kind of equal measure, and 5% others. So mostly overwhelmingly 11th graders in the audience tonight.
Great. All right, well, shall I start with the questions then? Because the very first one is the SAT changing? When and what are the changes to the SAT? And this will definitely be important to our 11th graders.
Thank you so much, guys. Yes, it is changing. I know we've been talking about this for a while, but it's finally happening this coming March of 2024. So for you know, the juniors here, and certainly for the sophomores and the freshmen, this is a relevant conversation. For those seniors, if you've already embarked on the SAT path, it's here through December of your senior year. So you're all set. You don't have to worry about this particular piece. And, you know, it's always been a choice, or for so many years, it's been a choice between the ACT and the SAT. These are comparable admissions exams. It really is about choosing the right test for your child. And that hasn't changed, even if you're a junior. And you know, broadly speaking, the SAT has some big similarities to its old version, right? It's still going to test math in a standardized fashion and multiple choice. It's still going to test grammar. It's still going to test reading comprehension. So the big picture, and it's still going to be out of 1600, although I know they've gone back and forth on that over the years too, if you've done this long enough. So in broad strokes, it's still the SAT. But they've certainly changed it in some meaningful ways. It is digital, coming in March. You will not be able to take it on paper. And I can go into some of the details of how that works. You know, you'll be taking it on either your personal computer, or you'll be taking it on a borrowed computer. You'll be downloading an app ahead of time and actually testing through that app. And it's adaptive, which means that they'll be giving you two different sort of modules on the verbal, which is the grammar and the reading, and on the math. And how you perform on module 1 will determine how which module you get in module 2. And it's much shorter. It's a 2-hour test instead of a sort of 3-hour test. And the College Board has certainly made clear that one of the things that they really want for this new SAT is for kids to have more time to do each problem. And so kids who already, I think, found the SAT to be the easier choice in terms of timing should find that it's even easier on that front. So yes, I'm still testing the same kinds of content, but in a different format on a computer in an adaptive context. and brand new in March. You won't be able to take the current SAT after the end of this year, after December.
And what would you say are the biggest differences between the SAT and the ACT?
Yeah, absolutely. And I see a little quick question about scratch paper. You will be able to use scratch paper on the SAT. So certainly you could have a pencil and paper. You can bring your calculator. There'll be a calculator actually in the application as well. So lots of ways to take a test digitally, but still use all your tools from the current SAT. In terms of the SAT versus the ACT, and I'll speak to the current SAT and the future SAT. Again, comparable exams, certainly the colleges have no preference between them, and that shows you that they are on some level very similar. They are testing, some core grammar knowledge, everything from punctuation to apostrophes to some sort of basic stylistic formatting sort of choices. They're both testing your ability to read passages and answer questions about them. They're both testing your math really through Algebra 2 with a little bit of pre-calc and some sort of miscellaneous things, heavy on the Algebra 1, the geometry. And so again, in those ways, they are similar. They're both timed, though the ACT is certainly longer at around 3 hours. And they are different in the way that they structure those questions. I guess I think of them as like two different games, and they have different rules to the game, even though they test similar skill sets. I mean, they're not fun games, we'll be honest, right? But they're two different games, and if you learn the rules of the game, you learn how to play, you learn the strategies, you can beat the game, whichever game you pick. And I would say the biggest differences are that the ACT features its own separate science section, not featured anywhere on the SAT except in little passages. And that science section is essentially testing a child's ability to read and interpret scientific passages, graphs, and data, and to extrapolate information based on that information provided. And the other big difference between the ACT and the SAT is that the ACT makes you move really quickly. So very few kids tell me that they could finish everything on their first go around without practice and without those strategies, because they really do ask you to do a lot in a short amount of time. And the SAT, not so much of a test of how quickly you can move, which is a relief to so many kids. But I think the College Board has always created tests that are tricky. I think the biggest feedback I get from every SAT iteration that's ever existed over the last 20 years, kids have come out and said, multiple answers sounded right to me, or I don't know, I don't know how I did. Whereas on the ACT, I think it's maybe a little more straightforward if you can nail the timing. But 6 of one, half dozen of the other, you got to pick the one that's easiest for you. And certainly the ACT has been the more popular test over the last decade, and increasingly so. I think that might be behind this College Board choice to revamp their test and try to make it a little bit more sort of appealing to kids. And some juniors will take the SAT and some will take the ACT, and it's really about which game you can beat sort of without so much work, and which one you can beat more effectively.
And how do you determine which test is best for you, the ACT or the SAT?
Yeah, so most of our juniors have already or will be soon taking full-length diagnostics, full-length ACT, which is still on paper, and a full-length SAT, which is, again, digital. And there are digital tests available, and we're proctoring them. So certainly that's the best way to do it. And I do encourage students to try a full-length version of each if they haven't already gotten started. And sometimes the scores speak for themselves. It's just so obvious that one is better than the other. But I always want to know the why behind the scores, right? Did you do perfectly on the reading until the last passage when you ran out of time? Well, if so, that tells me something different than if you didn't run out of time, but you struggled on all the passages. Is there a type of passage that's particularly difficult? And if the scores are comparable, then there's so many other factors to think about. When are these tests offered? Do we want to try a new one? How do we manage the sort of intricacies of these different tests and make a decision based on those? So sometimes the scores tell us, sometimes the scores aren't enough, and you have to dig a little deeper to figure out the path that's easier for your child.
Barry, how do you start to begin to put together a college list? And what's the ideal timeline for beginning to look at colleges?
Yeah, I think if we were speaking generally, 11th graders are best sort of poised to really be able to engage in the process. That doesn't mean that as a 10th grader, or even if you're, I mean, ninth is really early to be looking, but some people will. It doesn't mean that if you're a 10th grader really itching to go and you have a deep interest, there are some kids who have that, that you can't start. But I think typically 11th grade is really when you're starting to dig into it. Some people will go to a campus in 10th grade or earlier because they're in the area, and why not? And that certainly makes sense. What I always tell people is if you see a campus in 9th or 10th grade that you actually think that you like, you should plan on having to visit again later, because your lens is going to be so much sharper, and so much more. You're just going to have so much more data and just sort of opinions, that a place that looked really good before you saw other things, before you knew more things about yourself and the process and all of that stuff, is going to look very different later. So I would say 11th grade is kind of prime time. Some people will start visiting campuses around now in the fall, and there's a school break or something like that. By spring of junior year, you should start visits or be kind of in the throes of visits, I would say. I always tell people plan on spending your junior year spring break visiting colleges, because the weather's better. There's a break, and you have enough data points, whether grades, rigor, how the extracurriculars are panning out, scores, all those things, where you can start to really have a sense of what neighborhood you should be looking at academically. I mentioned campus visits. You asked about the list, because that's really a big part of building it. You're going to do some initial research on your own with your counselor, look and see how things appeal to you or appear to you on the screen or on paper. And that will determine where you then spend your precious limited days where you can actually physically go and see something. But the real impressions often come from the visits. Things can sound and look really nice on a website, or you hear a few great things. And then, sometimes people go to a campus, and I've heard parents say that kids said, I'm not getting out of the car. I won't even get out of the car here. Or you go somewhere and you're not expecting much, and you end up really loving it. You go somewhere because you're in the same geographic neighborhood, and you say, while we're here, we'll swing by this other school just because, it's convenient. So students especially have much stronger opinions about what they want and what they don't want, and what they like and what they don't like when they see things in person. So building the list for us happens over the course of 11th grade and doesn't really finalize until right around now. And when I say finalize, I mean, where you're applying early, where you're applying early decision, where you're doing early action. Every school on the list is set, and it really is just final, and you're plowing through the essays at that point. So it's a long process, but it's a slow and steady one that as you have more information, you can kind of tweak it and sharpen it as you go.
And what percentage of the college admission decision is based on your GPA, the SAT or the ACT, your extracurricular activities? Like, how do you weight that?
Yeah, I don't think in terms of like actual numbers or percentages for that, because I feel like, well, what would be the difference if I said 70 versus 76, or, 30 versus 34? I mean, it just, to me, is not the way I think. What I would also say is it depends, right? You just need to pass through the initial academic review. About 80% of students in any pool are going to pass through it. So let's assume you have a decent sense of whether or not you fit the general academic profile. Most people are. You pass through that first door, and now all the other factors come in. And I'm actually, by the way, I'm including in that academic profile scores if submitted. So transcript, which includes rigor and grades, not just the grades. I don't care if there's a GPA on the transcript. I don't care if you rank, like just what classes did you take in the context of your high school? what were the grades that you earned in 9th through 12th grade, if 12th grade grades are available, what are your scores if they're submitted? That's the academic review. Then you move into what many people think of as the softer factors, but are really what determines decisions at the end of the day, so long as you pass through door number one. And that's not what you do extracurricularly, but how you've done it, how you've engaged, how it's translated, how you've communicated it in the essays to each school. So that ends up looming really, really large. But if you can't pass through door number one, then what's behind door number two doesn't really matter. So I think, again, assigning a numerical value is hard. When you go to an information session, you'll generally hear them say that grades and rigor are most important, or they'll just say transcript is most important, followed by scores if submitted, and then they'll talk about all the other stuff. But in reality, as long as you pass through the academic review, the real emphasis is going to be on all that other stuff, so to speak. Again, not what you do so much as how you've engaged and how you ultimately communicate that in the essays, which you'll want to do differently for each school based on their values and kind of the things that they tend to favor one over the other.
Well, then this leads right into the next question, Bari, of what kinds of extracurricular activities are actually impressive to colleges, and what about summer programs and awards?
So this is a great question, and I would say it's always been the case that extracurriculars are extremely important. But when the parents in our audience applied to school, which was basically around the same time as I would have applied to college, it was really more about, you know, getting a certain number of activities, getting a leadership position. If you started a club or an organization, that was like the crown jewel and a big differentiator. And it was just more like you just had to do certain things. You certainly needed to do community service. And it being well-rounded was really the name of the game. And as with many things in the college admissions process, things have really shifted quite a bit. Now, I don't really care if somebody has like a leadership title. I just want to know more substantively, what did you do? What was your role? Like, what changed? How did it translate outside of that? How are you going to put this together, you know, relative to your larger profile and your own story? So it's more complex in a way, more substantive. It's not just about checking boxes, but, you know, so the extracurricular piece is really so much of where fit is assessed, because they're kind of looking at you and how you operate in your communities and your world. And so it's one of the most central places that they're looking to see and assess that piece, which is a huge piece of the decision-making process at a school. Do you fit there? And fit, as we know, has nothing to do with how much you think you fit. It has nothing to do with how well you could do the work. It has to do with how a particular admissions office is putting together their class. So this extracurricular piece, it's not better to volunteer at a homeless shelter than it is to jam with a band if you love music and you're going to really put yourself into that music activity, whatever it may be. So there's not a particular thing or things that are better or worse because they take more time or they sound more impressive. You know, and it's not just one thing. It's going to be the larger story and the larger picture that kind of comes to the fore. And I would say there was a second part. You said the extracurriculars.
Well, summer programs.
Oh, summer programs. Thank you. Summer programs are really an extension of extracurriculars. So what is good to do in a summer depends on what grade you're in, what you've done in prior summers, what you're able or not able to access or accomplish during the academic year. To me, summers are just absolutely wonderful times of opportunity. It's really, and especially the senior summer leading into 12th grade is like, it all comes together at that point.
Thank you. Back to Sasha for a minute. Can you take these tests multiple times? And there are follow-up questions to this as well, as in, will schools see the best scores? If you send multiple scores, will they mix and match? Can you talk about the whole process?
I'll give an overview of all of that, and I'm going to go back to the digital adaptive SAT. I see a lot of questions about
questions, please. Thank
so
you.
I'll go back to that as well. So the short answer is you can absolutely take these tests more than once, and almost all students do. And I encourage kids to take the test when they're ready, when they're confident, when they're feeling like they've had a good practice under their belts, right? A confident, well-rested kid who has had lots of practice, then it's time to take official tests. And certainly you have a huge amount of control over your scores. So we're not just sending kids in to take the test, just for fun or for practice, but certainly if you're not happy with your results, and lots of kids like to take a trial run and then they try it again and they improve. So certainly you won't need to send your scores. You have a huge degree of control over what colleges ultimately see. So that's some of the pressure off a very high pressure situation. Yes, you can take it multiple times. Almost everyone does. Yes, you can pretty much decide, or you can decide which scores colleges see. Can you mix and match?
There are small exceptions. Georgetown, of course, like
Georgetown,
the
yeah.
anomaly, and a
It's-
couple of exceptions, but just to put the asterisk there.
Yeah, and you'll be actually, we'll talk about self-reporting versus, sending scores through the College Board or through the ACT, but you're actually sending the scores to the colleges. And yes, Georgetown is always the anomaly. They like to stay that way, I think. But again, generally a lot of control over what colleges see, and certainly you can take tests multiple times, and no need to take it, many times. This is about the opportunity cost of preparing for these exams is high. It's like another course, right? Your junior year. So we're trying to sort of offer kids concise testing programs where they start at the right time, and they work really hard and really consistently, just like you're learning another language. They test at the right time, which isn't always late junior year when they're very tired and exhausted and have final research papers and tests and things like that. And then in terms of mixing and matching scores, I mean, it's a pretty complicated answer. And I know Barry can get into self-reporting, and the ACT is a little different than the SAT, but generally speaking, you can send multiple sets of scores or report your highest scores in different areas. And generally speaking, colleges will accept your highest scores. Some in the SAT and not the ACT. Some you have to report your highest composite or average on the ACT. It's a little dependent on the college and a little dependent on how they ask you to report scores. But and I know Barry would always have a preference for just sending one awesome set of scores, which is a concise, clean testing portfolio. But yes, there's an opportunity for most kids to send multiple sets. And as far as I know, sending half the old SAT, half the new SAT, that's not something I expect colleges to look at. But I mean, Barry can speak to that. I know there was a question about that. And in terms of what I know, I quickly talked about this test being adaptive, and then I should have gone into more detail. Essentially, everyone's getting module 1, right? Module 1 on the verbal or the math is going to be a mixture of easy, medium, and hard questions. And how you perform on module 1, if you perform very well, you will get a different module than kids who did not perform well on module 1. And that will be a harder module 2, consisting of mostly medium and hard questions. Whereas if you don't do well on module 1, you'll have easier set of questions on module 2. I don't know if I've ever said module so many times. And in terms of the scoring, the questions are weighted, which is not true on the current SAT or the current ACT, which means harder questions are assigned more value than easier questions. So certainly how you perform, it's not just how many questions you get right, although that will then be indicative of which your module you're delivered next. It's how many you do well, and then how many you do well in the second one, which of course the harder questions will be given more weight. So that's what it means to be an adaptive test. It really does mean that how you perform affects what you're given next, and that will not be the same for all the kids. And finally, I know this is so much all at once, but I know there's a question about should you prepare for both tests, and it's like preparing for 2 different games. You got to pick one and stick with it and pick the right one and be really secure in that decision early on. It's always hard for me when juniors come to me late in the game and they were working on the wrong test and they have to switch, and they do great, but it's, you want to pick one and you want to send one great set of scores. There's no extra points for sending great SAT and ACT scores. No one wants that. No one needs that. So it's really about picking one test. And, I do think it comes down to the kid, but if it were me, I mean, I personally, I'm pretty risk averse. I would be an ACT kid this year more than any other year. I like a test that's predictable. I like a test that has so many practice tests and never changes. I like to know the game that I'm taking, but that's not right for everyone. And certainly for some kids, the timing of the test, the stamina of the test, or even the content of the test will drive them towards this new SAT, which is a perfectly reasonable choice for some kids.
To add
Barry?
just
Yeah,
briefly,
please.
so with the reporting, because you've got to get the scores, right? Which is where Sasha is the whiz and the expert. And then it's what you do with the scores, right? And that's the admissions piece. So there's a few different things, and there's some nuances to reporting, and there's no way to get into every nuance and nook and cranny here, but in trying to speak with some specificity to what is a very general process. The way that it's reported on the Common App for the SATs, you're just going to put in your best verbal and your best math single score, done. The way that it's done for the ACT is you put in your highest single section scores for the 4 sections: English, reading, math, science, and then you enter in your highest single composite. So this is not your super score, that is different. Your highest single sitting composite. So you might have a higher super score from those 4 highest section scores, but that's not the composite that you are entering on the Common App. If a college super scores, and not all do, but if it does, they will then recompute from those highest section scores and create a new composite for you, your super score. The more selective the college, the closer attention they are going to pay to individual section scores, regardless of what it means to a super score. So if you have a 35 super score with a 31 in a section or a 32 in a section, and you want to apply to Princeton, it's not the same as another 35 that has a different composition. You've got to really pay attention to section scores. Another thing, there are a couple of follow-up questions about Georgetown. So Georgetown requires scores. They say that they expect you to submit all testing from every sitting that you've ever done. And they require official scores be sent to them. So no well, you can self-report, but you have to, in addition, as part of your application process, submit official testing from the college. Princeton is another one. There you can self-report on the app, but you also have to send official scores. So there are going to be, and there are others too, there are exceptions to these, and it really is dependent on where you're applying if these general rules apply to you. But it's really important to know that distinction of the single highest composite relative to reporting a super score. There's a lot of misunderstanding about that. So the colleges will see your highest single composite, even if you're self-reporting. You don't kind of get around it in that way. And like I said, the more selective the school, the closer they're going to look and the nitpickier they're going to be about each of those individual elements.
And just to be clear with self-reporting, that this means that this is what you're doing when you apply. Once you get in, you do still have to send those official scores to validate your reporting. You just don't have to send them all up front and pay those fees up front. Whereas Georgetown or Princeton will ask you to send them through the website officially, as well as reporting them on your common application, which you've always done. You've always put them on your application, but it's the difference between, do you need to send them officially right away, or do you only need to do that once you're accepted? So there's no getting around being, of course, honest and putting your real scores on those tests. And what Bari is sort of trying to get at is that on the SAT, it's sort of more forgiving in the self-reporting part than on the ACT, just in the way that it's presented. And certainly we always want those scores. We don't want any sub-score, a science section, a math section, anything to be lagging behind the others. And that's what Bari was saying when she said, if there's a 31 versus the 35, we want everything to just look no red flags anywhere. Everything looks great. And the more competitive the school, the more, as Bari said, they're going to be looking closely at not just the composite, but is it a composite that's from a super score? Is it going to be, is there one sub score that's lagging behind? All those sort of smaller details.
And also when you're submitting at the end for verification purposes, the admissions process itself is over. So if they see that you tanked on one section or a few sections here or there, it doesn't matter. It makes no difference. When you have to submit them to Georgetown or Princeton as part of the process, you're self-reporting those higher scores, but they're seeing the testing profile more fully. So it's an important distinction for when those scores are sent and the implications.
And I should note that if you're thinking about Princeton and Georgetown, there is a little safety net before you ever get to the reporting, which is that if your child goes in and takes the SAT and they feel terrible about it, right? And they're like, oh, I was a disaster. They can cancel their scores before it's ever scored. And those scores will never go to Georgetown or Princeton. They don't exist in your College Board account. That's the sort of parachute if the SAT can't do that once the scores are already in your College Board account, but before they ever get there, you can ask them not to score your test, and that will be nowhere on your sort of record. And the ACT will allow you to delete scores. You can write to them and they'll delete the scores. So that's an even nicer safety valve, I guess, if you want, because then you don't need to send those. So there's sort of lots of layers to this. And this is why when it comes to your individual child, it's good to have a deeper conversation about where they are, about the kinds of schools they're applying to. And we can go into more detail, Bari and I, about these sort of little nuances of it. But again, overall, there are lots of opportunities to take these tests. There's lots of opportunities to find the best scores, and then there are always exceptions to these rules.
With the exceptions, to what extent will the SATs remain optional or be eliminated, and what types of colleges are these? And then I guess the follow-up question to that is there a change in the importance of the SAT test for college admissions this year?
I'll take the second question first. If the question is just the SAT because it's changing as opposed to standardized tests, the answer is no, there's no difference. It's just in its new format. Those of us who have been in this business for a long time, I mean, I don't know if this is like the fourth or fifth at this point in like a relatively short period of time. So it's just, the natural cycle of things. So the change in to adaptive isn't changing the relative importance of the SAT or the ACT for that matter, standardized testing more broadly. We don't know exactly what the future holds. I think that's one thing we've all learned in the past handful of years. But it seems like most colleges are going to hold on to test optional. I definitely have spoken with colleagues in more selective admissions offices that have talked a little bit about just sort of looking at MIT and seeing that they live to tell the tale of going back to requiring, but I think it's an uphill battle for them to potentially do it. So I think there's talk of it at some level at certain colleges. Whether or not they will go through with it or whether it will be determined to go, to happen, I don't know. I would say people can, for now, feel comfortable assuming that it's just going to stay as it is for now. And we do know that it is test optional and it is test optional, but we also know that at the same time, that could also mean that it's helpful to, or more helpful to have competitive scores as part of your profile. So admissions officers are telling the truth when they say we are truly test optional. We are, and they do admit people without tests, and they admit people across demographics without tests, but they also admit more and fewer from certain groups. So I think you need to really contextualize and sort of think about your individual situation, also relative to what you realistically are going to be able to produce in terms of a score. Because it could be preferable to submit a score for you, but if you're not going to be able to produce it, then you need to say, I'm going to be test optional, move on, figure out how that impacts, particular schools and decisions you might get, and then you move forward. So I think what is going to happen in the future, we don't know, but my guess is that the vast majority of schools will keep their test optional policies. The optics are good and it's in their interest. And we know that they tend to adapt policies that are in their interest. It's also in some students' interest for sure, but there have been other things that have made it tougher for kids, tougher for students as a result of test optional. One of those things being, and maybe the biggest thing being, that so what a usable score is, or a quote unquote, I don't even want to say good score for a particular school, has just shot up. And so that has really made it much tougher for students, even though the overall test optional policy, of course, opens up so many possibilities as well. But there have been some maybe unexpected or unintended consequences of the policy that impacts students for sure.
So switching, but very topical, how should kids tailor essays with the new Supreme Court ruling?
Well, the colleges have kind of made that decision for you by almost every single one of them changing their supplemental essay questions for this year. So the good news is that it's not really up to you. They've made the decision for you by what they've chosen or not chosen, by the way, to ask. Not all of them have an identity question, but certainly more have it, many more have it than have had it in the past. And it was also, by the way, not an uncommon question last year and the year before. So just more schools have adapted questions about identity, and again, phrased more broadly typically, but identity. And I would say also that you're seeing more colleges ask about it, and you're seeing some more, I think, certain wording change for colleges where that essay question existed in the past. You're seeing the lawyers really writing the essays more than the admissions folks. I mean, I think the lawyers write it, admissions people look at it, or admissions people write it, lawyers tinker with it, or vice versa, but it is a collaborative effort for sure. So, you're doing what you did before. You're answering the question. You're considering the depth of your response. You're considering how authentic or performative it comes across as. You're considering how else you might be able to share information that may be relevant about yourself. So it's just another question that's on there in most instances, but should you choose to write about it, how you choose to write about it, I don't think it's an automatic that you should. Sometimes these questions are optional, sometimes they're not, but identity is more broadly stated. This can be a tough question for students who might not identify with their cultural background, let's say, as a primary part of their identity, because not everybody does, not every student does. So I think a big piece is whether or not the question is optional or not, and how broadly identity is defined. Sometimes they talk about community, sometimes they talk about identity. You see the phrase lived experiences quite a bit. Everybody is asking it a little bit differently. And like any supplemental essay question, you want to zero in on how each school is asking it and how you can best respond.
And what is the admissions landscape at the top schools for private, and this obviously says privileged students?
I'm not sure I understand the exact question, but my guess is the question is kind of like, has it changed for kids coming from private schools and privileged backgrounds? And the answer is, I don't think it's changed. I really don't. I mean, I think that colleges are increasing where students they draw from. They're increasing their geographic reach for sure, but I don't think, I mean, I haven't seen certainly with our students, anybody seemingly being penalized either by school or individual student. Yeah, I think it's still about, if you're a good fit, you can make the case for yourself and in a way that kind of speaks the language of the schools you want to talk to, then that's it. What it really, we have not seen that be an issue. And it does not factor in when we're looking and saying, do you have a chance of getting in here or not? I'm never thinking, will you come from a private school? never has that come into my calculus of determining, like, for strategy, for chances for admission. Not at all. It's like, what is the school looking for? What can you offer? How can you potentially frame it so that it comes across as the fit that they need or want? And can you do that then for school number 2 and differently for school number 3? But whether or not you're, coming from a privileged background, whether you're coming from a private school, not one of the many things that I'm thinking about when making a decision like that.
And will there be a change in the expectation of the status of legacy admissions, do you think?
I think that that's on the chopping block for sure. I mean, we've seen like the first few dominoes start to fall. It's an easier thing to do in the scheme of things. You're not seeing everybody jump ship just yet, but don't be surprised to hear some more schools joining. Already plenty of highly selective schools that have dropped the practice, both before the Supreme Court ruling and certainly coming up. So I think that's something that we shouldn't be surprised at as more announcements are made. I don't think, every place is going to fall at once per se, in the way that we saw with the pandemic, but I think we'll see a gradual move in that direction.
And for 11th graders, also, I think 12th graders might have a good sense of this already. What are the advantages of applying ED, and what's the difference actually between ED and EA?
Yeah, so ED is early decision, EA is early action. Early decision means if you apply under that plan and the college admits you, you have to go. And you have to, if any applications are active, you need to pull them. If you've been admitted anywhere, you have to decline. So you're basically saying, you're my first choice. If you take me, I'm coming. I don't need to see this process through. I don't care what any other college says that they want me or don't want me. I'm coming. So if there's a school you like enough to make that deal with and you can get it done early, like, that's great. There are certainly students who have no school that they feel that strongly about, or the schools that they do feel strongly about don't offer it. So not everybody is going to apply early decision. In every instance, applying early decision is going to give you a strategic advantage. I don't care what they say publicly, that it's, the better, stronger pool or whatever they're going to say. It's not easier. You have an advantage in early decision. You almost always have some advantage in early action as well. It's not always the case. There are a small number of exceptions, schools where it's harder. It also depends if there is also an early decision round at that college. Are there 2 early decision rounds? Because there's ED1 and ED2 at some places. EA has a lower pull the more ED options there are at a school. So there are some schools that offer ED1, ED2, and EA. There are some schools that offer ED and regular. There are some that offer early action and regular. I mean, there's and there are other, I don't need to list all the permutations. There are other versions of it too. So in general, again, if we're speaking in very broad generalities, applying early gives you a strategic advantage, though there are exceptions. And there are exceptions within the different types of early programs. And there are exceptions school to school, some of which, again, oh, wow, Georgetown being one of them, an anomaly, as well as some other schools where the early pool either is harder or truly no difference. And so that's, again, going to be case by case.
Sasha, how are you advising juniors about a testing timeline, actually, given the introduction of the new digital SAT?
Yeah, so taking aside the new SAT, I always have a sort of preference for the timeline in general, right? I mean, there's no right time to take these tests. Every kid is different. Some kids are at boarding school, right? So they do tons of work over their summers and they don't have any time when they're at boarding school to do SAT, ACT prep. Some kids have a fall sport or a spring sport or do the musical. There's so many things that come into play. There are kids who go abroad the second semester or study at other programs. But in general, I think you want your kid to be ready, but not burnt out. Okay. And I do think the sort of typical May, June of junior year, when I think high schools tend to really push their kids into testing, could it be right for your child? Absolutely. Do I find that it often disrupts your schoolwork, which is so important and you can't redo it? Yes. And so I tend to have a preference for sort of winter, spring of your junior year, and then coming back to it in your fall of your senior year. And I know, Barry, and I see this every year, especially if you come out of junior year with some very solid scores, coming back to them confident and experience your early senior year, and there's an August SAT and an early September ACT, and there's chances in the fall for both ED and for regular decision.
Sasha, can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Sure, please.
So my most favorite test date is fall of senior year. And I say it all the time by the way, like, our students don't prep. I just tell them, go in. You don't have to spend your summer prep. They prep the year before, not that you don't prep at all, but they prep the year before. They didn't hit where they needed or wanted to, but they're close enough, and we have a sense that they are capable to do so. Over and over and over again, kids go in, no prep, maybe a few sessions if they feel rusty. We don't want you to like be reading the instructions or be getting tripped up and not, but really no prep, going in fresh as a 12th grader, a little older, a little wiser, a lot more relaxed. And I mean, like, I'm not going to sit there and promise anything to anybody. I'm not going to hype something up that we don't think really is going to have much, but it really over and over again proves that we see significant jumps, like meaningful jumps in the admissions process and a student's chances and what we assess a school at, just by going in at the beginning of senior year. So yes, maybe it lasts longer, like the testing part of it, but it's so worth it. Like so worth it. Like, lose the 4 or 5 hours of your life and give it a shot. So I'm a big proponent of it.
Yeah. And I say to parents all the time, like, maybe you're hitting your 33 in April of your junior year, which is a really solid score, but maybe not exactly where we're headed finally. And then you take a nice long break and you just get those grades, because you can't redo that chemistry final. You can't redo that research paper. Junior year is a rough year. And then you come back to it over the summer. And as Barry said, oftentimes that's minimal. It's just taking a practice test or two to get back in shape, maybe a couple sessions, and then you hit the ground running in August, September. So just in general, I have a preference for kids testing when they're ready, when they start early enough, when they are through Algebra 2 as sophomores. There's a lot of, ifs and variables that are specific to each child, but I do have a preference for sort of fall, winter, spring of junior year, getting some solid scores, taking a nice long break. This is not for everyone, and coming back to it senior year.
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't mean that as your first rodeo and
we're not waiting.
That's like the punctuation point at the end. Like,
that's right. That's the 35 at the end of the road, not the first time you've done it. And those first times set you up to be that confident, wiser test taker that Barry's talking about. It's because you've had the experiences in February of your junior year, of April of your junior year. So going back to the digital SAT, honestly, I mean, sure, there are fewer materials, but there are materials. Is the test different? Yes, but the tests are always different, and we can always help a child prepare for whatever game is in front of them. I think my least favorite thing about the new SAT is the same thing I had about the old SAT, which is I don't like the timing as much, because you can't take it until mid-March of your junior year, which is okay. But that's where I'm starting to feel like we should take a break soon, right? Because we're about to get into spring break, where you're visiting colleges and you're doing all sorts of sports things and all the things you do over your junior year spring break. And then you're getting into April and May of your junior year. And so your next opportunity for the SAT is the first Saturday of May. Your next one is the first Saturday of June. That's my problem with the new SAT, is I don't like the March, early May, early June. And then certainly I'm fine with the late August and October dates that they have senior year. But the junior year dates are rough for the new SAT. And remember, you can get it done super early, but that's by December 7th of this year, right? And then it's all changing. And there's this big gap between early December and mid-March when there are no SATs offered. And they used to have a January one, they don't anymore. So the pacing of that could work for your child, and it may very well work for them, but you really have to be prepared to test in May and June, or one of those. And that can be a hard time for my burnt out, sleepy, tired 11th graders. And the ACT, I mean, it's not perfect. I mean, it's a tough test. I'm not, again, like Bari, I'm not hyping up something that doesn't have its own sort of flaws, but they offer testing all throughout the fall, right? And then they have a February test, though it's not offered in New York State. Kids go to Connecticut or New Jersey, or wherever they can test. They stay overnight. It's offered in early April, but right before things get crazy, that first Saturday in April. Then it's offered in mid-June, and I don't love the mid-June ACT, but at least for some kids, it has a whole full week but between the end of school and that June test, which is not true for the June SAT. And then you get to come back in September. So just the pacing of it may be the determining factor. And my preference, if we can do it, is that sort of fall, winter, early spring, take a break, come back to it. Summer before senior year, and then finish it off senior year if you need to. And again, these are the big generalities. There are many kids who test in May and June of their junior year and do superbly well on those dates. But it's exhausting time for these kids. They're asked to do so much. And you heard Bari talk about the depth of the extracurriculars, and certainly they wake up early and they work hard. And because it's a test optional landscape, or largely a test optional landscape, because they offer many test dates, schoolwork has to come first. And I mean, we spend so much time talking about these tests, but being a sort of, doing well in school, taking rigorous courses and thriving in those courses and finishing those off junior year on a strong note, or a high note, not to mix metaphors, is really, really important. And the opportunity cost of studying for the SAT in May is high.
For those who may not be as strong a test taker, strategies around that, or can you speak to accommodations on tests?
Sure.
So,
we can talk about accommodations first. Certainly many of our students have accommodations on these tests. Accommodations are granted to kids for a wide range of reasons. They might be because of a specific learning difference like dyslexia. It might be because of a physical disability. Eyesight might require a larger bubble sheet, or there could be psychological reasons why a child is rewarded extra time, or special accommodations, testing in a smaller group, testing at school over multiple days. There's a host of accommodations that both the ACT and the College Board will grant children, but the most common one is just time and a half. And as you can imagine, that's a gift to kids, generally speaking, to have extra time on these tests, particularly a gift on the ACT, where timing is so hard. And you apply for these accommodations, as you register for these tests. You go through your child's school, the learning counselor, the learning specialist there can help with it. And depending on why the accommodation is being requested, the sort of the portfolio or the application looks a little different. So obviously, if it's something to do with a physical disability, they're asking for different proof of that disability than if it is a learning difference. And certainly, even within those learning differences, there's dyslexia is something that is almost always caught early in elementary school, and so there's usually an expectation of a long track record of that particular learning difference. And they want up-to-date neuropsych evaluations, or IEPs if you're in the public school system. And they want a documented use of that accommodation in your child's school. So if your child is not receiving that kind of accommodation, again, usually extra time on tests, in school, it is unlikely that you'll be granted these accommodations. And if you have questions, again, about your child's specific needs, their learning needs, their physical needs, their emotional needs, there's lots of information. I can walk you through it. And the application process all happens through your school. Takes a few weeks for them to make a decision. Again, if the documentation is in line with their guidelines, they'll grant your child that accommodation, and they'll have that accommodation when they're testing, and they should have it on their practice tests as well, right? You want to practice the same way as the official thing. And if they're denied it, there is an appeal process that you can add further documentation to your application. And again, Kids apply for all sorts of reasons, and it's important that certain things are in place before you do that. So if you have questions about that, again, we can talk individually. And in terms
And
of being
important, just
go ahead.
to add real fast, is that when you receive accommodations on any of these tests, the colleges are not aware and not notified. So that's an important part. And if your child has a learning issue or something else that you might not want to disclose, you don't have to. And it won't be disclosed for you by virtue of them knowing that the tests were taken under non-standard conditions. And this hasn't always been the case. It has been now for quite some time, but it used to be that there was a little asterisk next to scores for students who took them under non-standard conditions. And so that has for a long time been not been the case. So just so you know, the colleges don't know, and it's your choice whether or not you want to disclose anything to them.
Correct. And it's in time and a half, it's still considered sort of a general testing thing. There are lots of testing centers that offer that. There's special testing that is a little bit harder to get, and that happens at your child's school and over multiple days. And of course, kids would love to take this test over multiple days. They take a little bit each day, then they don't have to work on the stamina. But with or without accommodations, again, this is a game. And if you take away one of the, particular rules, if you change the rules, of course, it can make it a little bit easier or a little more manageable, but also then, you have a longer test to take, and then we have to work on those snacks and all the ways we keep a kid going for 5 hours. Remember, right? It's a blessing, but it's also a curse too, to have that extra time. It's a long time to test. But overwhelmingly, kids do want those accommodations. They are helpful. And depending on your child's particular needs, they're either necessary or they're not. In terms of being a bad test taker, I'll say two things. One is I'll say, it's kind of just like saying you're bad at a game. I mean, yeah, there's lots of games I'm bad at, and I do believe in a child's capacity to become good at a game. And the question really is, how long is that going to take, and how much effort and money, and what is it going to take away from the child other pursuits? And if the answer is that the sort of cost is very, very high, well, then we have to weigh our options, right? Because as we've talked about, these kids are under so much pressure. They have so much. And if it's going to be years of work to beat the game, and you're going to show up with a score that's moderately helpful, right, that maybe Bari would send to some of your schools, but mostly not, we weigh that against what it cost you, right, in terms of the time you could be spending on schoolwork, on sleep, on extracurricular activities that you're passionate about. And I know Bari will tell you that if it's the right fit, she's had kids every year who do get in without scores. And that's not to say that they're not important. And certainly that they can help an application, some schools more than others, but it is to say that it is not the whole piece, right? And there are other pieces that are more important to the colleges. So I think it's about weighing the cost of these things. But I do believe that instead of saying that kids are bad at these tests, I'd say they haven't learned how to take them yet. And, I do believe in their capacity to learn how to take them. It's just a question of how hard that will be and how much time it will take.
I think also one thing, and I agree with everything you said, Sasha, at the same time, if you have a student who, let's just say, because I know we talk this way, not a good test taker, a bad test taker, starting them in 9th grade and saying, well, then we'll just start in 9th grade because it's going to take longer to get to the 35. It's like it's not literally just more time. Just if we had 6 years, you'll get to the 36. Like there is a ceiling for everybody, and you can get a little further. Certainly, my experience has been, it's the quality of the tutor and the honesty of the tutor, right, that you can rely on. And we always appreciate Tutor Associates in that way. When they say what's possible, like it's usually possible with their help. It doesn't mean that they can say to everybody, yeah, you could get a perfect score or you can hit into the high 30s. And I just think that's an important distinction to make, that yes, it may take a little longer. It may be more that a student shouldn't start. I mean, so often I see students who start early, they burn out right at the point when they can start giving you their best scores, and they end up taking longer. And it's like so psychologically damaging and miserable for home life. So I often find, even though it's counterintuitive, if you're not a great test taker, or you know you're going to need a lot of prep, starting earlier isn't actually always the best answer. Sometimes you wait a little longer when you're more ready to really receive and kind of implement the help and the strategies and all of that, and have a little bit more of the math under your belt or whatever it is. So I just want to make that distinction, that the message shouldn't be like, well, then start in 9th grade because we'll just take more time and get there.
Thank you.
And then we're at 7:30
Yeah,
actually.
we are. No, and it's been such an unbelievably informative evening. I cannot thank you enough. Is there anything you want to touch upon before we do say goodnight?
I would just say, I know there are more questions we haven't answered. I'm always available. If you email me, just at Sasha@tutораssociates.com, we can talk about your individual child, your individual questions. I know there's so many that come up. And it is really about your child. So we speak in these big generalities, right? But ultimately everything, when you talk to me and Bari, it's all about customizing things for your child's needs and giving you information about their own path towards the right college for them.
I always say when someone says like, what's the answer? I'm like, in admissions, it's always, it depends. Like, I need a lot other pieces of information, then I can tell you what's right for you. There are few things where it's just like straightforward, do this, don't do that. And it applies to everybody.
Well,
But thank you so much.
No, thank you both. Unbelievably informative, and nice to know you're always a resource for everyone going forward as well. So
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks everybody for joining us. Have a good evening, and best wishes for an easy fall semester for everybody. Good night.